If this story of loss and hope has touched your heart, leave your like as one who lights a candle in the darkness, and tell us, how do you imagine this encounter between two wounded souls seeking to heal together ends? The August sun fell mercilessly on Cedro Ridge, that tiny town embraced by ochre hills and mining valleys. Clara Whitmore contemplated the horizon from the porch of the family home, her rough fingers caressing the worn wood of the railing her father had carved years ago. The air vibrated with dust particles suspended in the golden light, as if time itself had stopped in that forgotten corner of the West. The Whitmore house, with its colored glass windows and reddish-tiled roof, dominated the hill like a silent lighthouse. From there, Clara could observe the winding path that descended toward the town, where the tiny silhouettes of inhabitants moved between wooden buildings and streets of dry earth. The smell of hot iron and wild sage mixed in her lungs with each breath. On her lap rested her father Elias's journal, with that last unfinished entry about the discovery of the silver vein. Clara ran her fingers over the faded ink, as if trying to connect with the essence of that man who had taught her everything about the healing properties of plants and the value of independence. A knot formed in her throat, tight as a root. "Miss Clara," Maria Chen's voice resonated from the path, interrupting her thoughts. "I bring news from town." The Asian woman, owner of the only haberdashery in Cedro Ridge, climbed the hill with hurried steps, her dark skirt raising small clouds of dust in her wake. Her face, normally serene, showed lines of concern that made Clara straighten up, tensing her back like a bow. The breeze brought with it not only the cinnamon scent that always accompanied Mrs. Chen, but also the weight of unspoken words that floated between both women like storm clouds. The lawyer Peterson's office smelled of rancid tobacco and old leather. Clara observed how the sun's rays penetrated through the half-closed blinds, drawing golden lines on the walnut desk, where rested the documents that had altered the course of her existence. "The territorial law is clear, Miss Whitmore," Peterson declared, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "No unmarried woman can inherit lands with high-value deposits. You have 7 days to marry, or the properties will pass to the county." Clara felt the air solidify in her lungs. Her green eyes, usually serene as a mountain lake, turned dark and, "Who would administer those lands, Mr. Peterson?" The question floated in the room's heavy air. The lawyer coughed, uncomfortable. "Mayor Alden has already submitted a formal petition as the county representative." Through the window, Clara could see the corpulent figure of Silas Alden walking on the opposite sidewalk, his brocade vest shining under the sun, his plump hands adjusting his pocket watch with satisfaction. That man who already controlled half of the local businesses, who had managed to get his doctor cousin, Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, to declare her father mentally incapacitated in his final days. Clara pressed the herb notebook against her chest. Under her fingers she could feel the worn pages where her father had noted each plant, each remedy, each secret wrested from the mountain. The only thing she had left of him, besides the house and lands that now threatened to be taken from her. 7 days, she repeated, more to herself than to the lawyer. Upon leaving, the sunlight hit her like a slap. The town spread at her feet, with its uneven roofs and dusty streets. In the distance, from the saloon, came the discordant notes of an out-of-tune piano. Mrs. Chen waited for her under the shade of an elm, her face a map of wrinkles and worry. "What will you do now, Clara?" she asked, her dark eyes studying her intently. Clara observed her own hands, weathered by work with herbs, marked by small scars from thorns and knives, hands that knew how to cure fevers, reduce inflammation, bring relief. Hands that had never held those of a man with marriage intent. "I'll seek a husband," she responded firmly, though something inside her broke when pronouncing those words. The stranger's arrival coincided with the first wind of evening. Clara observed him from the window of her herb salon as he unsaddled a horse black as obsidian at the inn stable. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a worn hat that partially concealed his face and a dusty coat that spoke of many roads traveled. Among the whispers floating through town, Clara had heard fragments about him. Jonas McCall, they called him. A peacemaker, some said. A man without destination, others murmured. He carried with him the weight of a tragedy that no one dared mention directly, but that was perceived in the rigidity of his shoulders and in the shadow that veiled his gaze. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent behind the mountains, tinting the sky with copper and crimson, Clara crossed the main street with determined steps. The dust swirled around her leather boots, and her dark skirt waved like a banner of determination. The men playing cards on the saloon terrace interrupted their game to observe her. The women chatting by the well fell abruptly silent. Jonas McCall was sitting in the farthest corner of the saloon porch, absent-mindedly carving a piece of wood with a knife. His fingers, rough and marked by ancient scars, moved with the precision of one who has spent many lonely nights shaping wood to keep dark thoughts at bay. Clara stopped in front of him, her shadow projecting over the man. He raised his gaze slowly, and she could see amber eyes that seemed to contain all the sunsets he had contemplated in his travels, eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. McCall," she said with a clear voice, deliberately ignoring the whispers growing around her. "I need to speak, with you, in private." He studied her for a long moment, so still that he seemed part of the worn porch. Finally, he put the knife in his vest pocket and stood up. He was taller than Clara had calculated, and she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. "Miss Whitmore," he responded with a deep voice, rough as stones rolling down a slope. "How may I serve you?" Clara looked around, aware of the attentive ears leaning in her direction. "Not here," she whispered. "My house at nightfall." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heels and returned the way she had come, feeling the weight of dozens of gazes on her back, and among them all, the most intense, that of Jonas McCall. The shadows stretched like spectral fingers over the hills when Jonas McCall ascended the path to the Whitmore house. As he passed, the cicadas fell momentarily silent, as if they too perceived the gravity emanating from that man. Clara waited for him on the porch, seated in an oak rocking chair that had belonged to her mother. Beside her, on a small table, rested a steaming teapot and 2 chipped porcelain cups, relics of a more prosperous time. An oil lamp projected a circle of golden light around her, creating a refuge against the growing darkness. "Mr. McCall," she greeted him, indicating with a gesture the empty chair in front of her. "I appreciate your coming." Jonas removed his hat upon entering the circle of light, revealing dark brown hair prematurely streaked with grey at the temples. His eyes quickly scanned the surroundings, a habit acquired after years of constant vigilance. "I'm listening, Miss Whitmore," he said, sitting cautiously, as if fearing the chair might collapse under his weight. Clara poured the tea with steady hands. The aroma of wild herbs filled the night air. "I need you to be my husband," she declared without preamble, her green eyes fixed on his. Jonas remained so still that for an instant Clara thought he hadn't heard her. But then a wrinkle formed between his eyebrows and a muscle tensed in his jaw. "Excuse me." "Not for love," she clarified, placing the cup in front of him. "For necessity, for survival." In the following minutes, Clara explained her situation. The territorial law, the 7 days she had left, Silas Alden's threat, the silver-rich lands that had been her father's legacy. "I offer you a deal, Mr. McCall," she concluded. "Immediate marriage, 20% of the silver profits, and the promise of divorce after a year when everything has calmed down and I can find a legal way to keep my properties." Jonas took the cup and drank a long sip, as if he needed time to process that unusual proposal. The silence extended between them, dense as the morning mist. "Why me?" he finally asked. "There are men in this town. Men you know." Clara interlaced her fingers on her lap. "The men of this town fear Silas Alden, or are already bought by him," she responded. "I need someone who has nothing to lose, someone who isn't frightened by threats." Jonas sketched a bitter smile, barely a grimace that tensed the corners of his lips. "I've heard that you resolve conflicts," she continued, leaning slightly forward, "that you've brought peace to towns where chaos reigned. How you will have also heard other things about me," he replied, his voice suddenly cold as mountain water. Clara held his gaze without blinking. "I know enough," she responded. "I know you've lost much, that you carry scars that none of my herbs could heal." A flash of surprise, perhaps of pain, crossed Jonas's eyes. Clara knew she hated Ad touched a deep wound, but also that she had spoken the truth he needed to hear, that she harbored no romantic illusions, that she didn't expect to heal his broken soul. "When?" he finally asked. "Tomorrow," she responded. "At sunset, in Reverend Mills's chapel." Jonas nodded just once, a movement so slight it could have been confused with a sigh. He stood up, placed his hat back on, and before disappearing into the darkness, pronounced the only words Clara needed to hear. "I'll be there." The small pine-wood chapel stood to the east of town, its narrow and elongated windows like fingers pointing to the sky. The setting sun filtered through the simple glass, projecting golden rectangles on the worn plank floor. Clara waited by the altar, dressed in a dark blue dress that had belonged to her mother. It wasn't a wedding gown, but it was the closest to formality she possessed. Between her hands, she held a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered that same morning, purple lupines, orange paintbrushes, and sprigs of silvery artemisia, tied with a faded ribbon. Reverend Mills, a gaunt man with a white beard and trembling hands, nervously reviewed the pages of his Bible. Next to him, Mrs. Chen and old Winters, a former miner who had worked with Elias Whitmore, waited as witnesses. The silence inside the chapel was so dense that Clara could hear the accelerated beating of her own heart. When the door opened, everyone turned their heads. Jonas McCall entered with firm steps, clean and shaved, wearing what appeared to be his only suit, black and austere, with a grey handkerchief knotted at his neck. His eyes immediately found Clara's, and she perceived in them a determination that reminded her of her father in the good days. The ceremony was brief, devoid of ornaments or sentimentality. The Reverend's words resonated in the empty space like stones falling into a deep well. When the moment came, Jonas took Clara's hand. She was surprised to feel a slight tremor in those weathered fingers, as if that man accustomed to violence feared this moment of feigned intimacy more than any confrontation. "I, Jonas McCall, take you, Clara Whitmore." His voice was deep and controlled, but there was something in it, a note of vulnerability perhaps, that made Clara feel a knot in her throat. The words of the oath, though empty of true love, were charged with a commitment that neither had anticipated. They had barely exchanged vows when the chapel door burst open. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison burst into the premises, his face congested with anger, his small dark eyes fixed on the newly married couple. "This is a farce," he exclaimed, waving some documents in the air. "Elias Whitmore left considerable debts with the bank. The property is mortgaged, a sepulchral." Silence followed his words. Clara felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. All her plan, her desperate attempt to save her father's legacy, seemed to crumble before her eyes. It was then that Jonas stepped forward. With a fluid movement, he took the documents from the doctor's hands and examined them briefly. His eyes, now cold as steel, were fixed on Morrison. "These papers are false," he declared, with a calm that was more threatening than any shout. "The ink is too recent, and I know well the signature of a dead man when I see it." Without more words, he tore the documents in two, then in four, letting the fragments fall to the floor like flakes of dirty snow. Morrison backed away, his face now pale as wax. "This won't stay like this," he muttered, before turning around and leaving precipitously. When the door closed behind him, Clara looked at Jonas with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. He returned her gaze, and for a fleeting instant something indefinable passed between them, a silent understanding that that marriage of convenience had just become something more, an alliance against forces that were just beginning to manifest. "Reverend." Mills cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Well," he said, closing his Bible, "I suppose you are now husband and wife." The Whitmore house, now the McCall house, Clara thought with a strange sensation, seemed different that night. The shadows projected differently on the walls, and even the familiar creaking of the floorboards sounded foreign. Clara prepared the guest room for Jonas, placing clean sheets and a jug of fresh water on the walnut dresser. From the window of her own bedroom, she observed how the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, increasingly dense until forming a silver mantle over the dark hills. The reality of her situation hit her with force. She was married to a stranger, a man whose secrets weighed as much as her own. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her. Jonas stopped at the threshold of her half-open door, his silhouette cut against the gloom. "May I?" he asked. Clara nodded, lighting an oil lamp that bathed the room with a warm and flickering light. Jonas remained by the door, as if fearing to cross an invisible boundary. "Early tomorrow, I'll go to the registry," he said. "I want to see exactly what lands are in your name and what rights we now have as He paused, searching for the right word. "Marriage." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly conscious of her white nightgown and her hair loose over her shoulders. "There's a map in my father's study," she responded. He marked all the parcels, including the one containing the silver vein he discovered shortly before. She couldn't finish the phrase. Jonas nodded, understanding what she couldn't express. "I'll also need to know who is trustworthy in this town," he continued, "and who is on Alden's payroll." "Maria Chen is loyal," Clara responded without hesitation, "and old Winters. The rest?" She made a vague gesture with her hand. "Fear can buy as much loyalty as money." Jonas leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. In the flickering lamplight, Clara could see for the first time a fine scar that descended from his left temple to disappear under his shirt collar. "Tomorrow they will come," he said with certainty. "Alden and his men. They won't give up so easily." Clara felt a shiver but straightened up, raising her chin. "I'm not afraid of them." A fleeting smile, barely perceptible, curved Jonas's lips. "No," he responded. "That's why I'm here." They looked at each other in silence for an instant that seemed to extend indefinitely. There was something in that shared stillness, in that wordless communication, that Clara had not experienced before, with anyone. "Good night, Mrs. McCall," Jonas finally said, slightly inclining his head before withdrawing. Clara remained motionless, listening to his steps moving away down the hall. Mrs. McCall, a name that wasn't hers, but that she now had to bear. A disguise that she had to turn into skin. She extinguished the lamp and lay down in the darkness, aware of the presence of that man on the other side of the hall, a stranger who was now her protector, her ally, her husband, in the eyes of the law and the world. The wind whispered among the poplars surrounding the house, and in the distance a coyote howled at the crescent moon. Clara closed her eyes, but sleep was slow to come. Dawn brought with it the smell of smoke and burning wood. Clara awoke startled, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window she saw a column of black smoke rising from the back of the property. "The herb shed!" she exclaimed, jumping out of bed. She dressed hastily and ran downstairs. The front door was wide open, and through it she saw Jonas running toward the burning shed, a bucket of water in each hand. Clara followed him, ignoring the stones digging into her bare feet. The fire avidly devoured the dry wooden walls of the yai. Small shed where she stored her medicinal herbs, her tinctures, her remedies. Years of knowledge reduced to ashes before her eyes. Jonas threw buckets of water on the flames, with precise and efficient movements, but it was evident that the fire had advanced too far. Clara joined him, forming a chain from the well to the shed, passing him full buckets that he emptied over the fire. Their hands met briefly in each exchange, wet and hot. They didn't speak. It wasn't necessary. The rhythm of their joint work acquired its own cadence, as if they had been performing that dance for years. When they finally managed to extinguish the flames, barely the charred skeleton remained of the shed. Clara ventured among the smouldering remains, looking for something that could be saved. Her glass bottles had shattered with the heat. Her bundles of dried herbs were now grey ash. Her recipe books, inherited from previous generations, had turned into black and brittle pages. She knelt among the debris, picking up a blackened but still intact stone mortar. She pressed it against her chest, feeling tears burning her eyes. "It was deliberate," Jonas said behind her. His voice contained an icy fury. "There are traces of kerosene on the ground." Clara nodded, unable to speak. She knew who was responsible, and she knew this was just the beginning. "We'll find whoever did it," Jonas continued, placing a hand on her shoulder. The contact, though brief, conveyed a comforting solidity. "It doesn't matter who held the torch," Clara finally responded, raising her gaze to him. "It was Alden who gave the order." She rose slowly, shaking the ashes from her skirt. Despite the destruction, something inside her had hardened, like steel tempered in fire. "I can collect more herbs," she said, more to herself than to Jonas. "The plants still grow on the hills. The knowledge is still here." She touched her temple with an ash-stained finger. "They can't burn it all." Jonas observed her with an expression that Clara couldn't interpret. Admiration? Respect? Whatever it was, it returned to her some of the strength she had momentarily lost. "What do you need?" he asked. "New jars, alcohol for the tinctures. Seeds, if Maria Chen has some in her shop," Clara responded, her mind already working on reconstruction. "And wood? I'll rebuild the shed closer to the house where I can watch it better." Jonas nodded. Without more words, he headed toward the stable where he had left his horse the night before. Clara observed him mount and move away along the path leading to town, his figure erect and determined against the morning sky. As she returned to the house to change her ash-stained clothes, Clara felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pain for the loss, anger for the deliberate destruction, but also a spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She wasn't alone in this battle. For the first time since her father's death, she had an ally. With renewed determination, she began to make inventory of what she would need to start again. Some rare herbs would have to wait until the next season, but many others grew abundantly in the nearby hills. And there was always her medicinal garden next to the house, small but well stocked with the most essential plants. As she worked, her thoughts returned again and again to Jonas McCall, to the man who had accepted a marriage, served convenience, and who now risked his safety to defend a property that wasn't really his. What motivated him? Simply the economic agreement they had established? Or was there something more, some old wound that resonated with her own struggle? The central plaza of Cedro Ridge bustled with activity that market morning. Improvised stalls displayed vegetables, cured meats, imported fabrics, and hardware items. The murmur of conversations mixed with the occasional neighing of horses and the metallic tapping coming from the blacksmiths. Clara advanced through the crowd with the basket hanging from her arm, collecting fresh herbs from farmers' stalls, carefully selecting those she needed to replenish her reserves. She could feel eyes fixed on her back, whispers that were abruptly interrupted when she passed nearby. "They say she's married a killer," a woman murmured to another, loud enough for Clara to hear. "I heard he killed 3 men in Tucson," her companion responded. Clara kept her head high, pretending not to hear. Gossip was inevitable in a small town, and even more so when it involved the daughter of the late Elias Whitmore and a stranger with a mysterious past. She was examining a bundle of sage when she felt a presence beside her. Dr. Ezekiel Morrison, with his black suit and leather case, looked at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. McCall," he said, pronouncing the surname with barely disguised disdain. "How unfortunate about your shed. Accidents happen so frequently in these isolated properties." "It wasn't an accident, Doctor. As you well know." Morrison leaned slightly toward her, lowering his voice. "Your father was a stubborn man, Clara. I see you've inherited that trait, but stubbornness can be dangerous in these times." "Is that a threat?" she asked, keeping her voice firm despite the trembling she felt in her hands. "A friendly warning," he responded, adjusting his gloves. "Your hasty marriage may have bought some time, but it doesn't change the inevitable. Mayor Alden has plans for those lands, plans that will benefit all of Cedro Ridge." "You mean plans that will benefit him and his partners?" Clara replied. "My father discovered that vein, Doctor, and we both know that his death was too convenient for certain interests." A flash of alarm crossed Morrison's face, quickly replaced by an expression of feigned concern. "Be careful with those accusations, Mrs. McCall. People might think that grief has deranged you." Before Clara could respond, a sudden silence spread through the plaza. Jonas McCall was making his way through the crowd, walking directly toward them. He carried a wooden box in his arms, probably the jars and supplies he had gone to find. "Doctor," he greeted dryly upon reaching them. Morrison instinctively took a step back. "Mr. McCall," he responded, unable to hide his nervousness. "Congratulations on your marriage." Jonas placed the box on the ground and straightened to his full height, his eyes fixed on those of the doctor. "Thank you," he said with a calm that contrasted with the tension evident in his shoulders. "My wife and I appreciate the good wishes, especially from those who were so close to her father." The double meaning of his words wasn't lost on anyone. Morrison visibly paled. "If you'll excuse me," he muttered, backing away. "I have patients to attend to." When the doctor hurriedly moved away, Clara felt she could breathe again. She hadn't realized how tense she was until she felt the pain in the muscles of her jaw, clenched throughout the conversation. "Are you all right?" Jonas asked, using for the first time a more personal tone with her. Clara nodded, surprised by the warmth she felt at that simple change in his way of addressing her. "I'm used to his intimidation," she responded, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. A group of men had stopped near them, observing them with hostile expressions. Clara recognized two of them as miners who worked for Alden. The tallest spat on the ground deliberately close to where they were. "Look at the witch and her new watchdog," he exclaimed loud enough for everyone in the plaza to hear. "How many men have you killed, McCall? Does she pay you with her potions or with something else?" Jonas visibly tensed, his right hand moving instinctively toward where Clara knew he carried a revolver under his coat. She stopped him, gently placing her fingers on his forearm. "No," she whispered. "It's what they want." For a moment she thought Jonas hadn't heard her. His gaze, fixed on the provocateurs, contained a ferocity that reminded her of a cornered wolf. But then slowly, the tension left his muscles. With deliberately calm movements, he picked up the box from the ground. "Let's go home, Clara," he said loud enough for the other men to hear. As they moved away, Clara felt a contradictory mixture of relief and disappointment. Part of her had wanted to see those bullies get what they deserved, but she knew Jonas had made the right decision. A public fight would only have given Alden the excuse he needed to act against them. "Thank you," she murmured when they were far. "Enough away." Jonas looked at her sideways, a slight smile curving the corner of his lips. "Don't thank me yet," he responded. "Next time I might not have so much self-control." For the first time in many days, Clara felt the urge to smile. It wasn't a threat she heard in his voice, but a promise of protection. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into a full month. Clara and Jonas established a silent but efficient routine. He helped in the reconstruction of the shed, his rough hands manipulating the wood with surprising delicacy. She prepared the meals and continued her work as a healer, attending to those brave enough to still seek her remedies. At night they sat on the porch, contemplating the stars in a comfortable silence, occasionally interrupted by conversations about the next day's tasks or news from town. They slept in separate rooms, as they had agreed from the beginning, but increasingly Clara found herself thinking about him during her hours of insomnia. It was during one of those nights when they heard the desperate knock at the door. Clara jumped up, covering herself with a shawl. Jonas was already in the hallway, revolver in hand. "Who is it?" he asked firmly. "Mr. McCall, Mrs. Clara." A woman's anguished voice pierced through the wood. "It's my son Timothy. He has the fever." Clara recognized the voice of Sarah Johnson, one of the few in town who had maintained her loyalty after the shed incident. Without hesitation, she opened the door. Sarah held in her arms her 6-year-old son, whose face was flushed with fever, his eyes glassy and half-closed. Clara took the child immediately. "Bring him inside," she indicated, heading to the kitchen where she had some of her basic remedies. "How long has he been like this?" "Since this afternoon," Sarah responded, following her. "Dr. Morrison came but said he could do nothing, that it's the mining fever and that—" Her voice broke. "That I should prepare for the worst." Clara placed little Timothy on the kitchen table and began examining him with expert hands. The child was burning, his breathing shallow and rapid, and his pulse irregular. "Jonas, I need cold water and clean cloths," she ordered, momentarily forgetting formalities. He nodded and put himself into action without questioning. Clara turned to her cupboard, where she kept the few herbs she had managed to save and the new ones she had collected. She quickly prepared an infusion of white willow to lower the fever and a poultice of ginger and marshmallow root to relieve the congestion in the child's chest. During the following hours, Clara and Jonas worked in perfect synchrony. He held the chi, so while she applied the remedies, changed the cold cloths when necessary, and administered spoonfuls of the infusion between Timothy's dry lips. Sarah observed them from a corner, her hands wringing a worn handkerchief, her lips moving in silent prayers. Near dawn, the fever began to subside. Timothy's face gradually lost its scarlet tone, and his breathing became deeper and more regular. When the sun began to peek over the eastern hills, the child opened his eyes and asked for water with a weak but clear voice. Sarah fell to her knees, sobbing with relief. Clara, exhausted but satisfied, dropped into a chair. It was then she felt Jonas's hand on her shoulder, a light but firm contact that conveyed more than any word of congratulation. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, kissing Clara's hands. "The doctor said he would die before dawn. He said there was no hope." Clara felt a wave of indignation. "The mining fever is serious, but not always fatal," she responded. "With the right remedies and constant care—" "Dr. Morrison barely looked at him," Sarah interrupted, drying her tears. "He said it was useless to try anything, that the disease was already too advanced." Jonas and Clara exchanged a look. They didn't need words to communicate what they both thought. Morrison had deliberately abandoned the child, perhaps hoping that his death would serve as an example for those who still came to Clara seeking help. "Timothy will need to rest," Clara said, refocusing on what was important, "and continue with the infusion every 4 hours. I'll prepare enough for several days." While Clara gathered the ingredients, Jonas helped Sarah accommodate the child in a more comfortable position. Clara observed with surprise the gentleness with which that man, known for his violent past, tucked in the little one and spoke to him in a low voice, telling him a story about a wild horse he had tamed in distant lands. When finally Sarah and Timothy left, with provisions of medicines and strict instructions for the coming days, Clara found herself alone with Jonas, in the kitchen, illuminated by the golden light of dawn. The weariness of the sleepless night weighed on both, but there was something else in the air, an intimacy born of having worked together to save a life. "I didn't know you had experience with children," she commented while cleaning the utensils used during the night. Jonas, leaning against the doorframe, sketched a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I had a daughter," he responded simply. Clara stopped what she was doing and looked at him. It was the first time Jonas had mentioned something so personal, the first crack in the armor he seemed to constantly wear. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing. The words were insufficient. He nodded, accepting her condolence without elaborating further. But something had changed between them. An invisible wall had partially crumbled, allowing a glimpse of the man behind the legend. The news of little Timothy Johnson's miraculous recovery spread through Cedro Ridge like fire in dry grass. By the time the sun reached its zenith, 6 people had appeared at the McCall's door, seeking remedies for ailments that before would have been taken to Dr. Morrison's office. Clara attended to all of them with the same dedication. The baker's wife with her chronic arthritis, the stable boy with an infected wound on his leg, the elderly miner with respiratory problems. Jonas observed from a discreet distance, apparently occupied in carpentry tasks on the porch, but always attentive to any sign of trouble. At sunset, when Clara bid farewell to the last patient, she collapsed exhausted into the porch rocking chair. Jonas silently offered her a cup of tea, which she accepted with a grateful smile. "They've returned," she commented, referring to the town's inhabitants who for weeks had avoided her out of fear of reprisals. "The healing of the Johnson child has emboldened them," Jonas responded, sitting on the porch step at her feet. "Nothing gives more courage than seeing the power of someone believed untouchable falter." Clara observed Jonas's profile silhouetted against the sunset sky. In recent weeks, she had begun to notice small details, how his expression softened when he spoke with the children who occasionally accompanied their mothers, the delicacy with which he treated the jars of her remedies, the way his eyes always sought the horizon, as if part of him were perpetually elsewhere. "What was she like?" she suddenly asked. "Your daughter." Jonas remained motionless for so long that Clara feared she had crossed an invisible line. She was about to apologize when he spoke, his voice low and charged with contained emotion. "Her name was Emma," he said. "She had hair like ripe wheat and eyes that changed color according to the light, sometimes gray, sometimes with flashes of green like yours." He paused and Clara held her breath, fearing that any movement might break the spell of that moment of openness. "She liked to sing," he continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the horizon. Songs her mother taught her, and she collected stones, small colored pebbles she found in our travels. She said each one told a different story. Clara felt a knot in her throat. She could imagine that child, so vivid through her father's words, with her collection of stones and her songs, and she could feel the raw pain that Jonas usually kept under control, now exposed before her like an open wound. She was 4 years old when the fire... His voice broke and he couldn't continue. Without thinking, Clara slid from the rocking chair and sat next to him on the step. She took his hand between hers, feeling the scars that crossed his palm, silent witnesses to a life marked by loss and suffering. "They keep her alive," she said softly. "Your memories, your love for her." Jonas briefly closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they shone with contained tears he refused to shed. "Sometimes I think I'm betraying her," he confessed. "Each day I breathe, that I move forward. Each moment I don't think of her." Clara squeezed his hand more firmly. "Living is not a betrayal, Jonas," she responded. "It's a tribute. You lived the life she couldn't live." They stayed like that, shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, while the sun sank behind the hills and the first stars began to twinkle in the purple sky. They needed no more words. The shared silence, charged with mutual understanding, said more than any conversation. That night, when Clara retired to her room, she felt that something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer simply two strangers united by an agreement of convenience. They were two wounded souls who perhaps could help each other heal. Autumn came to Cedro Ridge with fresh winds that dragged golden leaves and the aroma of ripe apples. 3 months had passed since the hasty wedding, and life in the house on the hill had acquired its own rhythm, a cadence of shared routines and comfortable silences. Clara had rebuilt her healing practice, attending to an increasing number of patients who preferred her natural remedies to Dr. Morrison's expensive medicines. The herb shed, now rebuilt more solidly than before, had become a small dispensary where she prepared tinctures and poultices. Jonas had assumed the management of the lands, negotiating with the independent miners who extracted the silver, ensuring they received fair treatment in exchange for their loyalty. Under his administration, production had increased, and with it, the property's prosperity. That October morning, Clara was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the sound of hooves approaching. From the window, she saw an unknown rider stop in front of the house. The man, dressed in a formal suit and wide-brimmed hat, dismounted with the agility of someone accustomed to long journeys. Jonas entered the kitchen, buttoning his vest. "Are we expecting a visit?" he asked, already heading toward the door. "No," Clara responded, drying her hands on her apron. "I've never seen him before." Both went out to the porch as the stranger climbed the steps. He was a middle-aged man, with a well-trimmed mustache and astute eyes that quickly evaluated the couple. "Mr. and Mrs. McCall?" he asked, removing his hat in a gesture of courtesy. "My name is Henry Carter. I'm the territorial judge assigned to this district." Clara and Jonas exchanged a look of surprise. The judge wasn't expected until the following spring. "It's an honor, Your Honor," Jonas responded, extending his hand. "We weren't expecting your visit so soon." Judge Carter shook his hand firmly. "I received some concerning letters about the situation in Cedro Ridge," he explained. "I decided to advance my visit to investigate personally." Clara felt a chill. "Letters? From whom?" "Alden, Morrison." "Please, come in," she invited, regaining her composure. "I've just prepared coffee." In the living room, Judge Carter took a seat in the armchair by the fireplace, while Clara served coffee in porcelain cups reserved for special occasions. Jonas remained standing, leaning against the doorframe, his posture apparently relaxed, but with tense muscles, prepared for any eventuality. "I've heard contradictory stories about you," the judge began after taking a sip of his coffee. "Some people describe you as victims of a plot to strip you of your legitimate properties. Others paint you as usurpers who have manipulated the law for your benefit. May I ask who these others are, Your Honor?" Jonas inquired, his voice controlled but with a barely perceptible edge. Judge Carter sketched an enigmatic smile. "Mayor Alden has been particularly Communicative, he responded. As has Dr. Morrison. They claim that your marriage is a farce, a convenient arrangement to evade the territorial law on inheritances. Clara felt her heart skip a beat. It was exactly what they had feared from the beginning. Our marriage is legitimate before the law and before God, she declared firmly. If the judge doubts it, he can consult with Reverend Mills, who officiated the ceremony. I don't doubt the legal validity of the marriage, Mrs. McCall, the judge clarified, but the intentions behind it. A tense silence ensued. Clara could feel Jonas's gaze fixed on her, silently communicating that she should be careful with her words. Your Honor, she finally said, my father, Elias Whitmore, discovered the silver vein on our lands after years of searching. He worked hard to establish fair mining where workers received their share. When he died, she paused, seeking the right words. Unexpectedly, I found myself in a vulnerable position. The law doesn't protect lone women, the judge nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. I met Mr. McCall in difficult circumstances, she continued, aware of walking a very fine line between truth and lie. Our marriage was quick, yes, but not therefore less significant. She looked at Jonas, seeking in his eyes the support she needed. What she found there surprised her, a warmth, an intensity she hadn't seen before, as if at that moment, faced with the threat of losing everything, both realized that what had begun as an agreement of convenience had transformed into something deeper, more real. I love her, Jonas said, and the simplicity of those two words, pronounced with a conviction that couldn't be feigned, filled the room. Clara felt something stir within her, a recognition of a truth that had been growing silently between them for months. Judge Carter observed them for a long moment, his astute eyes passing from one to the other, as if evaluating the authenticity of what he had just witnessed. Well, he finally said, placing his cup on the table, I propose something to you, Mr. and Mrs. McCall. I'll remain in Cedro Ridge for a week. During that time, I'll investigate all accusations and counter-accusations. I'll speak with the town's inhabitants, review documents, hear testimonies, and then I'll make a decision about the legitimacy of your claims. He stood up, putting on his hat. I suggest you gather any evidence or witnesses that might support your version of the facts, he added. Mayor Alden and Dr. Morrison certainly will. When Judge Carter left, Clara and Jonas remained alone in the living room, the echo of those two words, I love her, still vibrating between them like a newly plucked string. Jonas, she began, unsure of how to continue. He approached slowly, until standing in front of her. With infinite delicacy, like one who fears breaking something precious, he raised a hand and brushed her cheek with his rough fingers. I didn't lie, he said simply. And in that moment, Clara knew that she wouldn't have lied either if she had pronounced the same words. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Clara and Jonas traveled through town, speaking with those who might testify in their favor. Mrs. Chen, whose haberdashery had prospered, thanks to the fair commercial agreements established by Jonas. Old Winters, who had worked with Elias Whitmore and knew the true extent of the silver vein. Sarah Johnson, whose son Timothy now played and laughed as if he had never been on the brink of death. Meanwhile, Judge Carter conducted his own investigation, interviewing miners, merchants, and town inhabitants. His presence in Cedro Ridge had provoked a palpable nervousness, especially in the mayor's office, where the lights remained lit until late at night. It was during one of those nights of investigation when Clara and Jonas received an unexpected visit. James Morrison, the doctor's nephew, a young man of barely 20 with eyes bright with intelligence and a face that still retained the innocence of youth, timidly knocked at their door. I have information, he said in a low voice, nervously, looking over his shoulder. About my uncle and Mayor Alden. They quickly ushered him in and closed the door. In the privacy of the kitchen, the young man pulled from his pocket a small accounting book. My uncle has me keep his accounts, he explained. Here are recorded all the payments he has received from Mayor Alden during the last 2 years, including one, his voice trembled slightly, the night before Mr. Whitmore's death. Clara felt the ground open beneath her feet. She had always suspected that her father's death hadn't been natural, but having tangible evidence made the pain suddenly fresh, like a reopened wound. James, Jonas said, his voice grave with concern. "Do you understand what you're doing? This could have serious consequences for your uncle." The young man nodded, his face pale but determined. "I know," he responded, "but I can no longer continue being complicit. Not after seeing how my uncle refused to treat little Timothy, hoping he would die just to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara approached him and took his hands between hers. "It takes much courage to do the right thing. When everyone around you chooses the easy path," she said softly, "your father would be proud." James lowered his gaze, but Clara could see that her words had touched something deep in him. "My father always said that medicine should serve everyone equally," he murmured. "Before he died in the epidemic, he made me promise I would follow in his footsteps, that I would help people, not use them to gain power or money." That night, after James left with the promise to keep his visit secret until the final hearing with the judge, Clara sat next to Jonas. On the porch, the stars shone intensely in the black sky, and the fresh autumn air carried with it the scent of pine and damp earth. "It could be dangerous for him," Clara commented, worried about young Morrison. "If his uncle discovers what he's done—" Jonas nodded, his face somber in the dim light of the oil lamp. "I've told him to stay away from his uncle's office during the next few days," he responded. "And I've spoken with Maria Chen. She's willing to take him in her house if the situation gets complicated." Clara observed Jonas's profile against the starry sky. How was it possible that that man, whom she had once considered barely a means to an end, had become someone so essential in her life? "Do you think we'll win?" she asked in a low voice. Jonas turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "We have truth on our side," he responded, "and that's more powerful than Alden and Morrison can imagine." Clara felt an irresistible impulse. Slowly, like one approaching a wild animal, she leaned toward him and rested her head on his shoulder. Jonas tensed momentarily, surprised by the gesture but then relaxed. With an almost imperceptible movement, he put his arm around Clara's shoulders, drawing her to him. Thus they remained in silence, wrapped in the night, and in the growing certainty that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something as real and tangible as the stars above their heads. The morning of the final hearing dawned clear and fresh. The entire town seemed to have gathered in front of the small church, temporarily converted into a courtroom for the occasion. Clara could feel everyone's eyes on her as she walked alongside Jonas toward the building, their steps resonating on the wooden boards of the sidewalk. Inside, the pews had been reorganized to create a space resembling a courtroom. Judge Carter occupied a table at the altar, with his law book open before him. On one side sat Mayor Alden, with his ostentatious suit and gold watch, and Dr. Morrison, pale and visibly nervous. On the other side, 2 chairs awaited Clara and Jonas. "Before we begin," the judge announced when all were seated, "I want to make clear that this is not a formal trial. It's an investigation to determine the legitimacy of certain claims about properties and about possible irregularities in the administration of this town." His eyes swept the audience that filled every pew of the church. "I have heard testimonies, I have reviewed documents, and I have observed for myself life in Cedro Ridge during the last week," he continued. "Now, I'll give the opportunity to both parties to present their final arguments." Mayor Alden was the first to speak. With grandiloquent words and pompous gestures, he described his plans for the development of Cedro Ridge, how the proper exploitation of silver could bring prosperity to all, how the Whitmore lands were too valuable to be administered by a woman and a stranger without experience in mining. "The territorial law is clear, Your Honor," he concluded, adjusting his vest over his prominent belly. "Those lands should be under the county's administration for the benefit of all Cedro Ridge inhabitants." Dr. Morrison spoke next, his voice less sure than the mayor's. He described Clara as a woman disturbed by the grief of losing her father, who resorted to dangerous and unproven healing practices. He denied any irregularity in Elias Whitmore's death, affirming that he had succumbed to a brain fever after months of erratic behavior. When Clara's turn came, she stood up with trembling legs but a straight back. She felt Jonas's hand briefly brush hers, a small gesture but full of support. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and firm, "my father dedicated his life to finding silver in these hills, not to enrich himself, but to create a better future for our community. He dreamed of fair mining, where workers received their fair share, where the land was respected, not exploited to extinction. She paused, looking directly at the judge. When he died, I knew I had to continue his legacy. The law didn't allow me to do it alone, so I found someone who shared my vision. My marriage to Jonas McCall wasn't a scheme to evade the law, but a union based on mutual respect and shared values. She turned toward the town inhabitants who filled the pews. Ask the miners who work on our lands if they receive fair treatment. Ask those who have received care when Dr. Morrison gave them up for lost. Ask those who trade with us if we have been honest and fair. Jonas spoke next, his deep voice filling the sacred space of the church. He described the transparent administration. They had established the better wages for miners, the investments in safer equipment. And then, with a calm that contrasted with the gravity of his words, he presented Dr. Morrison's accounting book. A murmur ran through the audience when Judge Carter examined the book, his eyebrows rising with each page he turned. "Where did you obtain this, Mr. McCall?" he asked. Before Jonas could respond, a voice from the back of the church resonated. "From me, Your Honor." James Morrison advanced down the central aisle, ignoring the horrified look of his uncle. The young man stopped in front of the judge and, with a firm voice despite his evident nervousness, explained how he had discovered the irregular payments, the conspiracies between his uncle and the mayor, and even his suspicions about Elias Whitmore's death. "My uncle prepared a compound for Mr. Whitmore the night before his death," he concluded. "A compound that, according to my knowledge of pharmacology, contained dangerously high doses of laudanum and other sedatives." Chaos erupted in the church. Dr. Morrison stood up, shouting accusations of betrayal toward his nephew. Mayor Alden tried to speak above the tumult, threatening reprisals. Judge Carter repeatedly struck his book against the table, demanding order. Finally, when silence was restored, the judge spoke with an authority that admitted no reply. "I have heard enough," he declared, "and I have made my decision." Everyone held their breath. Clara felt Jonas's hand seek hers under the table, and she intertwined her fingers with his, seeking strength in his contact. "The marriage between Clara Whitmore and Jonas McCall is legitimate and valid before the law," the judge announced. "Therefore, the Whitmore lands and properties legally belong to both. There is no legal basis for the county's claim." A collective sigh ran through the audience. Clara felt an enormous weight lift from her shoulders, but the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "based on the evidence presented, I order a federal investigation into the activities of Mayor Silas Alden and Dr. Ezekiel Morrison. Both will remain in custody until the arrival of the federal marshals." Mayor Alden's face turned purple with rage, while Dr. Morrison seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. "This isn't over," Alden hissed as two men designated by the judge escorted him out of the church. Clara and Jonas remained seated as the audience slowly dispersed, still processing what had just happened. They had won, yes, but both knew that victory came with responsibilities. "What do we do now?" Clara asked in a low voice. Jonas looked at her, a genuine smile illuminating his normally serious face. "We live," he responded simply, "together." And in that single word, together, Clara heard a promise that went far beyond their original agreement, beyond the law and contracts. A promise born not of necessity, but of the love that had slowly blossomed between them, like a wild plant that finds its way between the cracks of the hardest rock. Spring came to Cedro Ridge with an explosion of color. The hills, once arid and ochre, were covered with wildflowers, purple lupines, orange poppies, and white daisies that undulated like a multicolored sea under the gentle breeze. 6 months had passed since the trial, bringing with it profound changes for the town. Alden's monopoly had been dismantled, his properties sold at fair prices to those who had previously been his tenants. His mansion, the largest in town, had been converted into a school where the miners' children now received free education. This mining cooperative, formed by former independent workers, prospered under the joint administration of Jonas and Old Winters. The men worked fewer hours for better pay. and accidents had decreased thanks to the new safety measures implemented. But perhaps the most significant change had been the arrival of Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a young and progressive doctor who had responded to the advertisement placed by Clara in the Denver newspapers. Together, they had established a small clinic where traditional medicine and natural remedies complemented each other, attracting patients even from nearby towns. James Morrison had become their apprentice, dividing his time between formal medical studies with Dr. Hartley and learning herbalism with Clara. His enthusiasm and dedication often made Clara think about how her father would have been in his youth before the difficulties of frontier life hardened him. That May afternoon, Clara was in her medicinal garden, now expanded to include dozens of different species. Her hands worked mechanically, pulling weeds and loosening the soil around the young plants, while her mind wandered in memories and reflections. The sound of hooves startled her from her reverie. She looked up to see Jonas returning from his daily tour of the mines, his erect figure on the black horse, the setting sun creating a golden halo around him. Clara stood up, shaking the dirt from her hands, and walked toward him with a smile that came from the depths of her being. It was no longer the cautious smile of one who fears showing too much, but the open expression of one who has found a home in another person. Jonas dismounted with a fluid movement and tied the reins to the post next to the porch. In his eyes, once always vigilant and distant, now shone a peace that Clara had never seen in the early days of their relationship. "How are the mines?" she asked, approaching to help him unload the saddlebags. "Productive," he responded, leaning down to deposit a soft kiss on her lips, a gesture that still surprised her by its naturalness. "Winters says the main vein could be richer than we initially thought." They walked together toward the house, their steps synchronized by months of cohabitation. On the porch, they stopped to contemplate the sunset that dyed the sky in orange and pink tones, a spectacle that never ceased to amaze them. Jonas took something from his vest pocket, a small stone of intense green color, veined with silver threads. "I found this today," he said, placing it in Clara's palm. "It reminded me of Emma's eyes and yours." Clara closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its solidity, its permanence. It was a small object, but charged with meaning, a bridge between Jonas's past and their shared present, a symbol of the connection they had forged. "I'll put it with the others," she responded, referring to the small collection they had begun together, stones of different colors and textures that Jonas found in his travels and that Clara kept in a carved wooden box. They sat in the rocking chairs on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, contemplating how the light gradually abandoned the valley. In the distance, the lights of Cedro Ridge began to light up one by one, like earthly stars. "Sometimes I think about how it all began," Clara commented, her voice soft in the stillness of dusk. "About that desperate proposal I made to you on the saloon porch." Jonas took her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "Destiny has strange ways of taking us where we need to be," he responded. "After losing Emma and Sarah, I believed I would never have a home again, that I was condemned to wander, searching for something I would never find." He paused, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last rays of sun were fading. "And then you appeared, with your impossible proposal and your eyes that wouldn't take no for an answer." Clara rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beating of his heart. "Do you know what day it is today?" she asked. "Exactly 1 year since our wedding," he responded. "The deadline we agreed upon for our arrangement." Clara straightened to look into his eyes, those eyes she could now read like an open book. "The divorce is no longer necessary," she said, an implicit question in her words. Jonas held her gaze with an intensity that still thrilled her. "It never was," he responded simply. He leaned toward her and kissed her, a kiss that contained all. They didn't need to say with words. The love that had grown between them day by day, the gratitude for having found each other, the promise of a shared future. When they finally separated, Clara pointed toward the east, where the first star of the night shone with clear and constant light. "My father used to say that stars are the souls of those we love watching over us from heaven," she murmured. "I like to think he's there, along with Emma and Sarah, observing us." Jonas followed her gaze toward the increasingly dark sky, where the stars appeared one after another. "Not just observing us," he said with a voice hoarse with emotion, "guiding us, until we found each other." Clara closed her eyes, feeling the spring breeze caress her face, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and freshly tilled earth. Indais, that moment of perfect peace, she knew that that marriage born of necessity and forged in adversity had transformed into the most precious of gifts, a true love, as solid and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them, as deep and rich as the silver hidden in their entrails. That night, as the stars slowly turned above Cedro Ridge, Clara and Jonas McCall remained on the porch of their shared home, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in unison, silent witnesses to an everyday miracle, the rebirth of two souls who, through pain and loss, had found the way back to light.